Happy Wednesday slash kind of Friday, everybody. We're on midterm break here after this class. I think, does anybody have a class after this one? Most everybody is off like after this class. It's got to be nice. You got to get the classes out of the way early. I think Dr. Lee had her class this morning, didn't she? Good. Okay. Because I was going to feel bad if I was the only one who was hosting the class and keeping you all between midterm break. Not so bad I was going to cancel class, but I would feel bad. I would feel kind of bad. Because, yeah, we got stuff to talk about today, board stuff. Before we start on today's topic, just remember, we are in week 8, week 9, your data analysis activity, your semester research project is due at the end of next week. Your Alteryx assignment, your first part of your Alteryx assignment is also due at the end of next week. So you do have plenty coming up that's going to be due on Friday. Please don't let that lag until the last minute. I would hate to be the cause of stress next Thursday when you have 3 different assignments that you have to complete. I guess there's just 2 different assignments because the discussion, next week's discussion will be due on Wednesday. But 2 big assignments due on next Friday. So get those out of the way, one or the other, so you can focus on the other one, whichever you don't complete. And then, we are going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity. So this is kind of a part 2 of our cybersecurity discussion. This is kind of an interesting topic to go into depth. I started talking about cybersecurity and going into depth on cybersecurity back in 2021, and that was when I first discovered the John Oliver video. I thought about replacing it. I honestly just kind of hope that he records a new video because sometimes he revisits topics, because that one's great. It's just a little bit dated. But for context, one of the assignments that I did with my students back in 2021 is we did another cybersecurity assignment that was a little bit different than what we're doing in this course. I had them go to a website, and I can't remember the name of the website, but it was a cybersecurity tracking website, Purple something. I don't remember what it was called. And back in 2021, I had them look up recent events and had each of them report on the cybersecurity attack. And some of the ones that they talked about in the John Oliver video were there, Kaseya, Colonial Pipeline, but no like real major companies. And then I repeated this assignment again in 2022, and every single one that was on the list that I provided was a major company that everybody had heard of. So the ramping up of cybersecurity attacks it's pretty significant. In the video, John Oliver talks about it. He says that it's actually quadrupled over a 3-year period, and that was in 2021. I would assume that scale is probably pretty consistent. We're probably looking 3 years later, it's probably quadrupled even more. Probably talking close to $1 billion business, if not more than $1 billion business. But there's some interesting things that I wanted to discuss with respect to cybersecurity, just some conceptual ideas. We started out talking about the framework for governing cybersecurity last week, and we got our introduction to it. This one's kind of a secondary introduction, but taking it from a little bit more, I don't know what the right adjective is here. I'm going to say a little bit less academic approach. Instead of looking at the framework, we're going to look at some articles and look at some items that relates to this but are not as cleanly structured. So the very first one I wanted you to look at is cybersecurity, the CISA website. So cybersecurity, I don't remember what it stands for. Should know this. CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, SCSA. So did anybody go in there? And so I've said this before. I encourage everybody whenever I give an assignment or a link to, especially to a website like this, to a little bit of digging. Like last week, I assigned you some information on NIST, and then I had to ask, what does NIST stand for? Okay, and everybody was like, deer in headlights look. All right, so CISA, I'm not really asking about what CISA stands for, but I am curious, did anybody do any background reading on CISA to find out what this organization is? So it's a governmental organization, and it basically deals with cybersecurity and the infrastructure that relates to cybersecurity, which is a real problem, by the way. It's one of the questions that we're going to discuss here in just a moment. But how old is this organization? Anybody do any digging on that? So take a wild guess. How old do you think this particular organization is, governmental agency?
Years?
Not quite.
No. 15 years.
15. You're getting closer. Just over 5 years old. Okay, it's actually 2018, so it's now about 6 years old. Which, think about that from context. We've been talking about some cybersecurity incidents. We talked about the TJX breach, which was 2006. We're going to talk about Target, which was 2012. The Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency was not founded in 2018. So basically 12 years after cybersecurity attacks really kind of started. Now, you may argue that cybersecurity wasn't really a prominent term until the mid 2000s, and that's fair, okay? But there were some other agencies that kind of loosely addressed these particular problems, but there was not one that dealt with computer crime specifically. And this was kind of a better late than never approach. That being said, the resources here that are listed here they're quite good. They do provide a little bit of context. So very, very easy definition. And because I'm feeling generous, I'm going to start at the back. And Matt, my GTRA, you're going to have this question, okay? And if you're asking, is this favoritism? Absolutely is, okay? I'm giving him the easy question first. All right. So how is cybersecurity defined, Matt?
Cybersecurity is defined as the art of protecting networks, devices, and data from unauthorized access or criminal use, and the practice of ensuring confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, that's all I have on my slide. But yeah, it's just basically this information right up here, and it's a good definition. Okay, we're talking about computerized networks, devices, and data. Now, networks we probably understood. The computer systems themselves we understood. Data is something that we've alluded to. We're going to continue going to about more detail about. Devices, those are a little bit more new, even though we've had computerized devices for a long time. What we kind of traditionally consider a computerized device is the terminology of that is now changing. We alluded to that last week when we talked about the Internet of Things, but we're going to get in more depth on that. But yeah, making sure that there's no unauthorized access, or more importantly, no criminal access to these items, and trying to assure confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So our CIA triad again, trying to make sure that information is secure within those systems. These are not business systems, though. These are going to be any type of systems because these are not restricted just to business operations, which is an important distinction. But something we probably could have clarified or guessed moving forward. So that was really good, and because that was so good, I'm gonna stick with you, Matt. Okay. This one is a little bit less defined in the terminology, but I'm sure you probably have a good explanation for this. Why is this issue a bigger issue today than it was 10 or 20 years ago?
Well, because in the distant past of 2004, nothing was as networked or had as many networking features as they do today. Not all the devices today that are networked have the same amount of encryption, and a lot of your applications store critical data as plain text. So it's on you, the consumer, to make up for the faults of these manufacturers and be diligent in securing your devices.
Today, we kind of accept that everything is connected to the internet. That is something that's really, really prominent, and we believe that a lot of devices, even devices that are not necessarily needed to be connected to the internet, are connected. Handheld devices, that's kind of a given, and our computers have a constant internet connection. You log into a computer system on campus, you assume that you're going to have internet access. How long has that been true for? How long has it been true that you can actually log onto a computer and get immediate access to the internet? For large
AOL.
What was that?
AOL.
AOL. Well, so for large organizations, like for universities or companies, that's probably been about 30 years. Okay. For consumers, that's probably been closer to about 20 years. And I made the joke that back in the late 90s, early 2000s, if I wanted to get on the internet, I had to take my phone line. It was actually a land phone line. That was what landlines were used back for then in the day. It wasn't for phone calls, it was for internet connectivity. And we actually had to connect to the internet that way. And so it was a very interesting transition period because we went from this point of phone call or home phones just basically being used for phone calls, like you occasionally use this thing for. I know that rarely happens. Has anybody ever made a phone call on one of these? Just out of curiosity? No, never. Okay. Anyway, yeah, used to have phone calls. Then people started using it more highly useful for internet, more connectivity for internet. So much so that a lot of homes started actually getting multiple phone lines. One so they could actually have the phone so they could receive calls, and another so they could have internet connectivity. And then we had direct connectivity, which that's existed for about 20 years in most settings. But with that has been the growth and the prominence of connection of devices to the internet. And with that means that there's going to be unauthorized access risks. And so that has just been continuously growing over time. Now, did this exist 20 years ago? Yes. Did it exist to the same extent it does today? Not even remotely. Not even remotely. We've got much bigger concerns, particularly as the tools have evolved in different ways to create access and to create accessibility for these items. Okay, so moving on. According to the CISA article, what are the primary risks related to cybersecurity? So since I'm starting at the end and then I'm moving forward, Tyler, you're online. What did you identify? What's your group identify as the primary risks?
Yeah, so we said malwares and hackers, so they can steal your information and lock it up, basically.
So yeah, I believe the line in the article says malware racing your tiny system, attacker breaking your system and altering files, and attacker using your computer to attack others, and attacker stealing your credit card information to make your unauthorized purchases. So those all represent different types of cyber crimes, some of which we've already alluded to. We've talked about data breaches, which is the last one. You steal your credit card information, making unauthorized purchases. Malware attacks, that's something that is fairly frequent, which is just basically disabling a system. Altering files, that's kind of that's a hacking attack that is less prominent nowadays. Usually if a company or organization is going to attack your computer, they're going to do it for a profit-based motive. That might be something along the ransomware lines that we talked about before. So loosely related to the ransomware discussion we're going to have here in just a little bit, but all of these represent different kinds of attacks that we could observe. All right. Well, with that, let's go ahead and we'll move to other Matt. And you probably not a good call you Matt, other Matt. But since I already talked to one Matt, I'm talking to the other Matt. Okay. Which one of you would rather be other Matt? Okay, Matt Foster is other Matt. So Matt Alpha, Matt. We're not going to do that. We're just going to say Matt and Matt. All right. Matt Boyce, what's your group say as far as which of the risks do you think is most prevalent in the current cybersecurity environment?
So we said making unauthorized purchases because it happens so often.
Yeah. Data breaches are certainly problematic in accessing information. There was a TV show that existed a few years ago, and this is probably at or around the pandemic. It was canceled. It was called Adam Ruins Everything, and it was basically a fact show that Adam Conover, who was a writer for College Humor, put together about all these things that we believe are all well and good, and it kind of talked about the dark side of it, and all the implications of those. And one of his episodes is about the internet and about how people have access to information. Your information is likely out there. I don't want to cause you alarm if you think that you're nice and safe and secure and that your credit card is completely secure and that you just use it for purchases. It's likely out there. There's probably going to be people who have access to that information. And probably the only thing that prevents them from utilizing that detail is just excessive security protocols that are in place. That being said, your password has likely, or at least some of your passwords, hopefully using multiple passwords. One of your passwords likely has been infected in a data breach. You can actually go online. There's a website I discovered several years ago. I'm going to sound really silly saying this, but it's Have I Been Pwned? PWNED, okay, which is old leet speak from current computer terminology. And you can actually type in your email address, and it will tell you if your email address has been compromised in a data breach. I looked at one that I had for 30 years, which is my Hotmail address, and I've had that since basically the internet began. And I had 9 data breaches on that one, and so that was one that I had to make sure that I updated my password pretty regularly. I don't know. I haven't typed in the Truman State one, but I don't know. Has Truman State ever been the victim of a cyber attack? No. Okay. Not that I can recall. All right, we'll get to that. Yeah, I like the way Lotus is the first one to pipe up on that. When I remember specifically on the day of the cyber attack, she was sitting right there and said, "Shut down the computers." Yeah, one of those memories that will never go away, Lotus. You'll always be in my mind for that particular moment right there. Yeah, yeah. Yes. If I ever have an autobiography, I'll have you write the foreword. So, and it'll talk about the cyber attack. Okay, so certainly some concerns about data breaches. There's a lot more risks, though. They are pretty diverse and concerning. We definitely have all been affected by the issue of the ransomware attack that occurred at Truman State. It did definitely cause some disruption, and so that puts some interesting context to what we're going to be talking about a little bit later on. But moving on to the third part of the question. So the third question says, according to this article, what are the best practices that organizations should follow with respect to cybersecurity? This is probably one of the best takeaways of this entire discussion. All the things we're going to talk about are good piece of information to have, but this is one that I think that everybody in this room, and then you should know, and then you should make sure you transfer this to everybody who you work with and everybody you engage with. So Dottie, you have the great responsibility of being able to share this information. So what's your group identify?
So cybersecurity best practices include keeping software up to date, running antivirus software, using strong passwords, changing your default usernames and passwords, using multi-factor authentication, using a firewall, and being suspicious of unexpected emails.
All right, so can we conclude that everybody had pretty much that same list of items? If you did not have that same list of items, then you might want to go catch Dottie after class and say, okay, can you repeat that for me? So that was a good, diverse list, and it's a very, very specific list. There are some ones that I think that we all are very, very aware of. Keeping software up to date, antivirus software, passwords and usernames. We're very well aware of that at the Truman State level. In fact, I have to change my password for Truman State here in the very near future. I recently got that email saying it's about to be 180 days. It's tedious because I don't like changing my password because I'm used to the password that I have, but it's a really good practice to have to make sure that there's good cybersecurity. All right. Multi-factor authentication. Have we got a little bit of a taste of that here at Truman State as well? Yeah, that was following the data breach. Now we've got that Duo software that you have to use to log in, and that app, again, tedious, but really, really important. It's really important that we actually have that. And then probably one that goes without saying, but I'm going to talk about it anyways. Be aware of suspicious emails. Has anybody on their Truman account received suspicious emails that they've seen that kind of look like phishing emails? This is something that it's a little bit challenging because I've encountered that at Truman State probably more than I have anywhere else. I don't think it's because of Truman State's network. I think it's because of the environment that we live in nowadays, where there's just easier access to that information. But yeah, you definitely have to be suspicious. I will say that I see it on my other accounts too, but on the other accounts, it's very obvious to tell that it's a phishing attempt. Like somebody saying, what would be a good example? Yeah, I got an offer for a customer awards bonus from Lowe's. So Lowe's, the home improvement store. There's not a Lowe's in Kirksville. I don't remember the last time I'd been in Lowe's. Okay. So I knew that this was an obvious phishing attempt, but some of these can be very, it's very, very challenging to tell if it's true or not. There's some interesting stories about email phishing attempts. Used to be, I got one at least a few times a week. I got one from either Dr. Caden or Dean Prasad. And it was not actually Dr. Caden or Dean Prasad. It's people who were kind of trying to pretend to be those individuals and get information from me. Usually it was probably my telephone number. And I'm not sure what they were going to do with my telephone number, but I never actually fell for that. I'm assuming Dr. Caden's already got my telephone number because she needs to have contact with me. She has to tell me to do something. And Dean Prasad doesn't care. Yeah, a lot of concerns to be wary of. The good news is I think that our detection software with respect to emails, those are going to become a lot more proficient at being able to identify those particular types of attacks. But we're also going to run into the problem that they're going to become more sophisticated and a lot stronger, especially as AI tools evolve. We've started finding that the AI tool written emails can actually emulate the tone and context of a actual human being. Particularly if you have samples of the way that person writes, then you can replicate a lot of the way that they operate. So I have a very, very specific demeanor that I operate when I write emails. And if you had a good AI tool, you could replicate that and you could send something out to the class as it was from Dr. Barnes, okay? Which please don't do that, by the way. That would just be really, really awkward. But you could probably do something like that in today's day and age. Now, I'm giving you bad suggestions. I'm going to move on. All right. Question number 4. We started moving on to the Washington Post article. So this is actually about the Biden summit that occurred in 2021. Again, a dated one, but I think it's really important for context. According to the Washington Post article, what are some of the factors that are contributing to the U.S. government's inability to address cybersecurity issues on its own? Okay. So Lotus, what's your group identify for this one?
He said factors contributing to the government not being able to address this issue on their own is because there's been no declared actual war, despite the fact that there's constant attacks.
Right. So one of the big issues is the fact that there's no real way of kind of prosecuting these attacks, as we know that these cybersecurity attacks are occurring, but who do we actually prosecute for them? Who do we assign responsibility? Now we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the nature of that and the jurisdiction and a little bit later and what some of the challenges are. Some of the other concerns that we might have talks about infrastructure. So remember, cybersecurity, CISA stands for Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and infrastructure is a critical word there. Who operates most of the infrastructure related to cybersecurity? Is it the United States government? No, it's the private companies that own these, or I guess public companies and some, but the owned organizations outside of government control. And so if you think about it, it's probably the big network operators and big organizations probably are the ones who own the majority of these infrastructure items. And that creates a lot of problems because if the government's trying to handle this, they need the cooperation of these organizations. Also, there was a significant shortage of cybersecurity professionals, and that remains true today. At the time of the writing of that particular article, it was 500,000 cybersecurity professionals. So there was a shortage of 500,000 people who were needed in this field in the United States alone, which is a pretty colossal number. I know we tend to gloss over those, but if you think about it, that means that more likely than not, an organization does not have a cybersecurity professional or a necessary staff of cybersecurity professionals to address a problem. We're going to get into that when we start talking about the healthcare issue, because the healthcare is definitely seeing problems in this area, and it's been a particular concern in that particular field.
I mentioned that in my response to it wasn't in the article you asked us to specifically cite something from, but I just recently heard about this and it freaked me out so bad. There was recently an announcement on healthcare networks, and these people are stealing people's medical photos taken for medical purposes.
Yeah.
Patients, and then the companies are abiding by the hackers' request of these people's medical needs. They're just thinking about them.
Yeah. So yeah, we're kind of spoiling a little bit what we're going to be talking about in advance is the concerns about technologically accessible medical records. How many of you all have physical copies of your medical records? Okay, that should be a lot more hands in this room than just mine. Okay, so should have physical copies. Why? Because if your medical records are electronic, then they are subject to disruption. Not to say they're not subject to disruption if you have physical. Like all it would require is a fire in wherever you're storing, whatever room you're storing your medical records, and those get destroyed. But at least having redundant copies would be good. So why is that such an issue? Well, imagine that you run into a problem where you need urgent medical attention and you can't have, there's no access to your medical records. That's going to create a much bigger issue than you might think, simply because they might under the scope of the problem or the detail. Particularly if you have medications that you're allergic to, you don't have access to your medical records, they could give you one of those medications and it may be very untimely for you if that was the case. So yeah, and calling people out there saying, get your medical records, get physical copies of those. Yeah, that's one of the nice things about being old is that I still remember when my medical records were actually physical, so I can retain some of those. But yeah. Now, Washington Post article discusses the unusual environment of cooperation amongst companies who are normally business competitors. Does the need to improve our cybersecurity infrastructure represent a contradiction in the normally independent operations that comprise U.S. and international capital markets? This one's kind of an interesting question, but I think probably an easy question too, Sydney. What do you think?
Cybersecurity, if their market offerings are different from the cybersecurity threat they all face together. But I guess if the company is providing cybersecurity, that could pose problems. But if your market offerings are good.
Yeah. So it's still similar to a business to business environment that the companies normally operate in. It's just in this scenario, they're not sharing resources, they're sharing cybersecurity best practices and infrastructure. Now, the example that I kind of used for this, first of all, I'm going to say, is any of you currently watching Game of Thrones and is concerned about spoilers for the TV show Game of Thrones? Okay. If you're really concerned about spoilers, then you can walk outside for about 2 or 3 minutes. Okay. I don't think I'm really going to spoil anything, but this is the example. So if you're not familiar with Game of Thrones, it was actually modeled on the War of the Roses from, I believe it was 1400 Europe. I could be completely totally getting my timeline wrong. Obviously there were no dragons in the actual War of the Roses, but they took a little bit of license to that. And there were a whole bunch of different families that were competing with one another for the superiority in that particular time. And that's kind of what this talks about, is these families that are competing with one another. When I say families, I'm not talking about families of 4 or 5 people. The families are massive. It's basically the main family and then kind of all of the people who ally with those families. So hundreds, if not thousands of people. And anyway, the book and the TV show are all consistent. They're all fighting with one another, but there's a bigger threat looming on the horizon, okay? The White Walkers, which I'm going to call cybersecurity, okay? Or cyber attacks. And once all basically the White Walkers in this TV show, they're like zombies, but ice zombies. Okay, so if you really dig ice zombies, then it's a good show to check out. But they start attacking things, and everybody says, "Look, okay, I know we all are trying to compete against one each other. I know we all don't necessarily get along, but if we don't work together to address this threat, then it doesn't matter who wins this war between all of us. Everybody's going to be wiped out." So they kind of all come together and address this problem. At least that was kind of the intention. I won't give up the whole story. I will say that there was one family that was kind of scummy compared to the other families. But yeah, if you've seen the show, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, it's kind of the organizations all working together to address a much bigger risk. It supersedes their competition. It supersedes their business practices. And so is the question then comes: is it possible to share critical resources for countering cybersecurity threats while maintaining the confidentiality of proprietary information and resources? Sydney, what's your group say on that?
Wait, sorry.
The second part of the question. So can we share resources and maintain confidentiality?
Yes.
Yes. It is not an easy line to toe. It is not an easy road to walk, but it is certainly possible. Keep in mind that proprietary information is something that we try to very closely protect in most organizations. That's one of those reasons why financial reports are so heavily scrutinized. And you know, when we talk about that from a financial accounting perspective, say, why don't we disclose more information? The detail is, if we disclose too much information, then our competitors will have an advantage over us. And so proprietary information, there's a reason why that we use that terminology to describe it. We want it to be held private. That being said, too much information held private means that we can't effectively address an issue. So again, what is the dividing line? It's not clear. It's a very subjective concern, but it is something that we do need to establish, and it's important to establish. And I think it's certainly possible. All right, question 6. The Washington Post article mentioned the threat of regulation looming with respect to cybersecurity. Should our cybersecurity infrastructure be regulated at the company level? Leah, what's your group say?
Since we noted that the article said even the threat of regulation has been boosting companies into action, so obviously regulation we think would have some benefits, but at the same time we think companies probably are just scared of the word regulation. But we think at least like a baseline regulation for all companies would be good, especially related to the second part of the question.
Yeah, so the question then, it's that question that kind of Leah alludes to is whether or not cybersecurity infrastructure is a social good. What do you all think? Is cybersecurity infrastructure a social good? So we tend to think of social goods as things that should be available to all people at all times. And I think protection of our data and our security of our networks probably is something that's really important. And there comes into the idea of the weakest link approach, is that even if the large organizations take this seriously, if the smaller organizations don't, if they're not regulated, they may not care. And as we see in many scenarios, it only takes one point in the chain to actually cause the whole thing to crumble. So as that old saying, the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, we have to make sure all the links in the chain are secure. What do you, at a more general level, what is your opinion of regulation in this class? How many people think regulation is a good thing? How many people think it's a bad thing? How many people don't care? Okay, at least you're honest. Okay, yeah. Now, there's differing opinions. Regulation, too much regulation is definitely a bad thing. Okay, not enough regulation is technically a bad thing. There has to be a point where regulation is going to reach its maximum impact. Do I think we get that right most of the time? Probably not. Okay. But there's alternate concerns. If we don't regulate cybersecurity infrastructure, there are dangerous concerns about abuse by certainly cyber attacks, but also the organizations themselves. Interesting example of regulation. Back in the late 1990s, 2000s, there was an energy company that was operating in the unregulated California at the time, because I think this was the early 2000s, because this was during the Bush presidency, and they had put a lot of pressure on California to deregulate the energy industry. So this particular company had a habit of, during peak energy season, basically they would shut down their plants, their factories that were generating energy, and they would call it a blackout. They'd say, "Oh my gosh, there's so much demand for our energy, we're going to have to jack up the prices." Sounds like a pretty shady business practice, doesn't it? That's one of the problems with the lack of regulations. They were doing this and they were getting away with it. By the way, does anybody know the name of that company? Give you a hint. They have a big E in front of their name. It was Enron. Yes, it was Enron that was doing that. Yeah, just another reason to hate Enron. Yeah, yeah. They never give us any shortage of ammunition for that. So there we go. All right, moving on to the John Oliver article. I was told by an individual in the class that I probably should have said a disclaimer in this article. I did. Okay, I did say about the language, but there was some visual imagery that apparently was a little bit problematic. I apologize for that. I know I worry about what happens now when you go back. It says, what are you learning in your advanced AIS class? It says, oh, we're learning about digital security on products that I would never buy. And so, yeah, that's something that you would you probably weren't expecting. If you're not familiar, this John Oliver was a correspondent on the Daily Show, and Daily Show was very popular in the 2000s. It is very biased, but they do a really good job of the research. And as long as you are aware of the existing bias, you can kind of accommodate that. But their research is top notch. I really appreciate that. I really enjoy kind of the context, even if I don't necessarily agree with everything they say. You probably are familiar with some of the correspondents of the Daily Show. Jon Stewart was the main one who was the commentator. But like Stephen Colbert, who's now doing the Late Show on CBS. Steve Carell was a correspondent there. Ed Helms, who was on The Office. John Oliver, obviously I mentioned. There's several others that you probably are familiar with. But it was kind of a comedy news thing. And the interesting thing is they did polls. People who actually watched The Daily Show were actually more knowledgeable about current events than people who watch normal news segments, which was just kind of sad because it was a comedy show. That's all it was. But yeah, this is one of my favorite ones to watch because they do a lot of critical issues, but they're not afraid to delve into them a little bit more, in a little bit less, what's the word I'm looking for? Serious manner. Okay, they tend to be a little bit goofy with their approach, which kind of makes it easy. So talked about the cascade effect of ransomware Kaseya, providing a brief list of entities that were impacted by the attack. Okay, so what were those entities? What were those entities that were listed? Got it here. A grocery store chain, a public broadcaster, schools, and a national railway system. So does this support or a future answer to question 6? So remember, question 6 was, is cybersecurity a social good? And so I think there's a pretty clear direction that I was taking you down here, but I'm going to see what you came up with. Matt, what was your group's consensus on this one?
So our consensus was that, in relation to our answer number 6, John's example would argue in favor of more regulation because the companies failed to self-regulate, and there's a huge problem for way more people and organizations than it needed to be.
Good, yeah, and so with respect to question 6, I think we can argue that it's definitely a social good simply because we have one problem that occurs and it affects multiple organizations. Like Kaseya is compromised and it affects multiple organizations. So there's multiple stakeholders. Thus, the need for regulation at multiple levels because, again, we want to make sure that everybody's following best practices and best policies. Question 8. So John Oliver discussed several recent ransomware attacks that occurred in the healthcare organization, as well as the infamous Colonial Pipeline attack. What basic IT controls could have been implemented in the organization to prevent or at least reduce the occurrence of cybersecurity incidents? All right. Tyler, you're back on. What did your group say here?
Yeah, we said they should have done multi-factor authentication and more software updates regularly, and also run antivirus software and use firewalls.
Okay. So some of the things that we identified previously, specifically with healthcare, what was probably the biggest gap that we identified? What was one of the biggest issues that they identified in the piece? So what percentage of healthcare organizations did not have a qualified cybersecurity professional in place? 85%. 85%. Okay. Now, I'm assuming everybody goes to a doctor at least to a regular basis. Now, keep in mind that there is a higher likelihood than not, probably a 1 in 6, close to a 1 in 6 chance. So 85% chance that if there was an attack, your information could be breached or could be compromised or completely lost. So certainly problematic. The Colonial Pipeline one is very interesting. I love the the snip they show of the response by the CEO saying we're using dynamic passwords. It was just that this one had a single factor authentication password, but they was using a dynamic password. It wasn't like they were using Colonial 123. And that's interesting because right around the same time there was actually a co-op up in Iowa, not too far from here. It's called a New Cooperative, it's a farmers cooperative for exchanging resources and trade. They actually had a similar size attack. I believe it was on the scale of I want to say $20 million, but I could be confusing that with another one. And I think they ended up paying on the ransomware in that particular one. But That one was particularly an issue of dynamic passwords. I think that they identified that 60% of the passwords had not been changed from the default password. And I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in class, what the password was. It's chicken1, chicken followed by the number 1. And so that's kind of interesting when we think about whether or not there's dynamic infrastructure in place. That kind of endpoint indicates that there's not in a lot of organizations. Now, let's think about this from the context of Truman State, because you all are in a class that I'm sitting here telling you, we need to have good infrastructure. There's a reason why we've got these programs on the computer that are running. There's a reason why you have to sign in multiple times into these programs that you're using. We're trying to make sure the security of our systems, okay? Do we think that everybody on campus is as knowledgeable as the people in this room? Probably not. If we had done computer science, they probably would tell us a thing or two, okay? Data analysis, data science, they probably had some different insight. But let's say we go over to some of the liberal arts groups and we go to like history or English. Now, I'm not trying to bash on them. I'm just saying that they do not have courses that specifically talk about cybersecurity protocols and data security and things along those lines. And if we think about it, there may be some instructors who have been here for a long time before any of these mechanisms were put in place and don't take them as seriously as before. Is that a risk to the entirety of the organization? Is it a risk to campus? I don't know how the ransomware attack at Truman State from a few years ago had started, but I do know that it's likely because of somebody who did not follow protocols that they should have been following at the time, which is like, don't write down a password on a sheet of paper where somebody can see it. That would have been likely a scenario that happened. That sounds so foreign and so far away. But that was actually kind of a practice that everybody used back in the 80s and 90s. They said, okay, I can't remember my password. I'm just going to write it down on a Post-it note on a sheet of paper. I think somebody was mentioning Ferris Bueller's Day Off a few weeks ago when I was talking. And there's actually a scene in that, or not Ferris Bueller's Day Off, War Games, the other Matthew Broderick movie. We're talking about War Games. Was that Olivia we were talking about? There was actually a scene where he goes into the principal's office and there's the passwords, the current passwords to the system were written down on a Post-it note. He just knew exactly where it was. So that was not something that's all that foreign. Again, War Games is like a 40-year-old movie, which, you know, for many of you guys, like 40 years old, that's like 2 centuries ago. But yeah, it's not actually that far gone that we've been doing that, and people still do silly things like that even now. Question number 9. John Oliver mentioned that the most recent ransomware attacks involve ransom for cryptocurrencies. Why are cryptocurrencies being used as a medium for exchanging these attacks? So Matt B., what did your group say on this one?
We put because they're difficult to trace.
That's right. So one of the aspects of cryptocurrencies, we talked about this a little bit in AIS, is that cryptocurrencies have low regulation. We're going to talk about this more a little bit later in the semester. I don't want to say completely unregulated. Some of them are. But we're starting to see regulation, particularly in other parts of the world. The U.S. is still dragging its feet because that's what they like to do. But we are starting to see regulation, but they're not regulated nearly as heavily as other forms of currency that operate in other parts of the world. So there's a lot less friction in transactions, and it makes them harder to reverse and harder to track. Okay, so does the existence of cryptocurrency present additional business environment risks to organizations beyond the ransomware implications? This is probably a fairly straightforward question, but Dottie, what'd your group say?
I said yes, because cryptocurrencies can also be used for like fraud or theft that are unrelated to ransomware.
Right, and so I don't want to get too much in detail or too much mired down in this particular question, simply because we are going to address this question in more detail when we start talking about cryptocurrencies specifically. But the intuition is that if we've got a currency that is largely absent from regulation, there's a lot of different things we could do with that we can't do with normal currency. And there was actually an interesting example in the John Oliver video. Does everybody remember the Monero cryptocurrency? So he was talking about basically it's the perfect cryptocurrency for criminals conduct exchanges. And so yeah, and the advertisement was just kind of is very, very upbeat, right? Like all the advertisements in there were very upbeat, and it's just kind of like, I can't believe something like this exists, but it does, all right? And it's very obvious if you think about it from a nefarious perspective what the purpose of this is. And so cryptocurrencies are something we need to be very, very aware of and very cautious of, because these enable these types of activities, not just ransomware and cybersecurity attacks, but as Dottie pointed out, fraud and other risk areas for concerns where there's going to be currency exchanges that we need to avoid that regulation. People want to avoid that regulation. All right, question number 10. One of the final observations in John Oliver video is that many cybersecurity attacks on U.S. organizations emanate from groups operating in foreign countries. Is it possible to develop effective domestic cybersecurity protocols when the instigators of cybersecurity attacks are not subject to domestic protocols and penalties? Lotus, what did your group think on this one?
They said that you could still have effective protocols such as keeping employees educated, keeping your cyber system controls up to date, and maintaining strict rules within organizations surrounding passwords and confidential information. Making sure that those are all those up.
Yeah.
Employees are well.
That's an excellent answer. Okay, so we're talking about the protocols that are in place in organizations and even in regulation protocols that could be in place with respect to the best practices in this area, all trying to make sure that the systems are as safe as possible. So these sound an awful lot like controls. All right, and you guys knew I was going to go there because I always go there. All right, but they sound an awful lot like controls. The question is, are these preventative controls or are these detective and corrective controls? These are definitely preventative controls. So that's the thought we need to keep in mind here is that all of our protocols that we need to keep in mind that are going to be the most effective are going to be these preventative protocols, the preventative controls, the things that stop things from happening. So the answer to this question is yes, as long as we're willing to accept that we have to address the problem before it happens and not try to address it after it happens. Is that what most organizations do? No, we've already seen examples of that. We're going to see another example next week. Organizations are notoriously bad about trying to implement preventative measures. And we've talked about the cost analysis aspect of that already. But that's something that's very concerning. In order for us to be effective against a situation that we don't have any control over, we're going to have to prevent things from happening rather than detect and correct. Now, could we create detective and corrective protocols? We could create them. Are they likely to be effective? So I'm changing the question on you. I'm saying we're talking specifically about response criteria. Our response criteria, our response protocols, are those going to be effective when we're talking about jurisdictions that the United States has no control over? I'm leading you to an answer, and the answer is probably no, okay? The answer is probably no. And that is something that's really concerning. If we've got organizations that are willing to say, we're going to wait until see something happen, we'll wait and see until something happens, and then something does happen, they're likely in for a much bigger effect or a much bigger problem than they initially considered. So wait and see cost analysis is not going to be effective in this area, but that's the problem is that a lot of organizations, particularly smaller organizations, that's the approach that they're taking. All right, with that, I think we're done for today. Have a wonderful break. I'll see you all on Monday for third party cybersecurity.